Welcome to History for Snooze. Every age of history carries echoes of those who lived not in palaces or temples, but in the shadows of power. Among them were the enslaved, men, women, and children whose lives were bound by the will of others, yet whose presence shaped the very foundations of ancient societies. Tonight, we step quietly into that world. From the bustling streets of Rome to the grand estates of Greece, from households to battlefields, slaves lived lives that were at once invisible and essential. They cooked, built, labored, and sometimes even advised, woven deeply into the story of civilization, though seldom remembered in its glory. As you listen, imagine the sound of tools striking stone, the hushed conversations in dim quarters, or the silent endurance of those who bore history on their backs. Behind every monument and feast, there was unseen labor, and behind that labor, human lives with hopes, fears, and quiet resilience. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe and join our growing circle of listeners. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always a gift to know how far these stories travel. Now, rest easy, and let us journey together into the life of a slave in the ancient world, where silence often spoke louder than words. Slavery was one of the most pervasive and enduring institutions in human history, existing across virtually every ancient civilization from the earliest recorded times through the fall of the Roman Empire and beyond. The lives of enslaved people in antiquity were marked by profound hardship, systematic dehumanization, and the complete denial of basic human rights. Yet within this brutal system, enslaved individuals demonstrated remarkable resilience, found ways to maintain their humanity, and in some cases achieved positions of influence despite their bondage. The institution of slavery in the ancient world was not monolithic but varied significantly across cultures, time periods, and geographical regions. From the palace workshops of Mesopotamia to the silver mines of Attica, from the plantations of Roman Sicily to the households of ancient Egypt, the experiences of enslaved people differed dramatically based on factors such as their origin, skills, physical characteristics, and the specific needs of their owners. This comprehensive examination explores the multifaceted reality of slave life in antiquity, drawing from archaeological evidence, literary sources, legal documents, and inscriptions to reconstruct the daily experiences, social relationships, and survival strategies of millions of people who lived in bondage. We will investigate not only the harsh realities of exploitation and abuse but also the complex social dynamics, economic relationships, and cultural practices that shaped the lives of enslaved individuals across the ancient Mediterranean, Near East, and beyond. The primary source of slaves throughout antiquity was warfare. Military campaigns routinely resulted in the enslavement of entire populations, with victorious armies capturing thousands of prisoners who were then sold into bondage. The scale of this practice was enormous. When Rome conquered Epirus in 167 BCE, approximately 150,000 people were enslaved in a single campaign. Similarly, Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul reportedly resulted in over 1 million Gallic people being enslaved. The process of enslavement through warfare was brutal and traumatic. Captured individuals were often marched hundreds of miles in chains, separated from family members, and sold in distant markets where they had no hope of escape or rescue. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, as they were considered less likely to rebel and more adaptable to new circumstances. The psychological trauma of sudden capture, the loss of freedom, family separation, and transportation to unfamiliar lands created lasting wounds that shaped the entire experience of slavery. Military slaves faced immediate decisions about survival. Those who demonstrated useful skills, whether as craftsmen, interpreters, or administrators, might avoid the harshest forms of labor. However, the majority faced a grim future of heavy manual work, with little hope of ever seeing their homeland again. The Romans developed sophisticated systems for processing war captives, including temporary holding facilities and established trade routes that efficiently distributed enslaved people throughout the empire. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically became slaves themselves, creating a self-perpetuating system that ensured a constant supply of enslaved labor. These verni, as they were called in Rome, often had different experiences from those enslaved through warfare. Born into the system, they typically spoke the local language fluently, understood cultural norms, and sometimes developed closer relationships with their owners' families. However, being born into slavery also meant never knowing freedom or having memories of a different life. These individuals grew up accepting their status as natural, though this did not necessarily make their lives easier. Verni children were often separated from their mothers at young ages to prevent strong emotional bonds that might lead to resistance. They were trained from childhood for specific roles, whether as domestic servants, agricultural workers, or craftsmen. The Roman legal system was particularly harsh regarding children born into slavery. The principle of partus sequitur ventrem meant that a child's status followed that of the mother, regardless of the father's status. This rule ensured that even children fathered by free men with enslaved women remained enslaved, though such children sometimes received better treatment or opportunities for manumission. Debt, slavery, and economic bondage. In many ancient societies, individuals could become enslaved through economic circumstances. Debt slavery was particularly common in early Greece and Rome, where free citizens who could not repay loans might forfeit their freedom. This practice was eventually restricted in Athens by Solon's reforms in the 6th century BCE and in Rome by various laws, but it continued to exist in modified forms throughout antiquity. The transition from free citizen to slave through debt was often gradual and involved complex legal arrangements. Individuals might first pledge their labor as collateral, then find themselves unable to work off their debt, ultimately becoming permanent property. This form of slavery was particularly tragic because it often affected entire families, as wives and children could be included in debt settlements. Economic slavery also included the practice of exposing unwanted infants, who were then collected and raised as slaves. This was legal and socially accepted in most ancient societies, providing another steady source of enslaved labor. Exposed children who survived were typically raised specifically for slavery, receiving training that would make them valuable in slave markets. Piracy and kidnapping. The Mediterranean and other ancient waterways were plagued by pirates who specialized in capturing free individuals for the slave trade. Major pirate operations, such as those based in Cilicia, maintained sophisticated networks for capturing, holding, and selling human beings. The scale of piracy-based slavery was substantial. Plutarch reports that pirates were selling slaves in markets throughout the Mediterranean on a daily basis. Kidnapping raids were not limited to maritime activities. Land-based raiders regularly attacked vulnerable communities, particularly those in border regions or areas with weak governmental control. These raids specifically targeted children and young adults who would fetch higher prices in slave markets. The constant threat of enslavement through piracy or kidnapping created widespread fear and influenced settlement patterns throughout the ancient world. The victims of piracy and kidnapping faced particularly severe trauma, as they were typically free individuals with established lives and identities who suddenly found themselves in chains. Unlike those born into slavery or captured in warfare, These individuals had clear memories of freedom and often spent years attempting to escape or hoping for rescue. Daily life and living conditions. Housing and accommodation. The living conditions of enslaved people varied dramatically based on their roles, location, and owner's wealth. In urban settings, domestic slaves often lived in small rooms within their masters' homes, sometimes in basements or upper floors with minimal amenities. These quarters were typically cramped, poorly ventilated, and lacking in privacy. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum reveals slave quarters that were functional but austere, with simple beds, basic storage, and little decoration. Rural slaves faced even harsher conditions. Agricultural workers were often housed in barrack-style buildings called ergastula, which were essentially prisons designed to prevent escape. These structures were deliberately uncomfortable and overcrowded, with slaves chained at night and constantly supervised during the day. The ergastula system was designed to break the spirit of enslaved individuals and prevent organized resistance. Mining slaves endured the worst living conditions of all. Those working in silver mines at Laurium in Attica or the Spanish mines of the Roman Empire lived underground for months at a time, sleeping in tunnels and caves. Archaeological evidence suggests that many mining slaves were kept permanently chained and lived in conditions that can only be described as subhuman. The average life expectancy of a mining slave was estimated at just a few years. The physical environment of slave housing reflected the fundamental dehumanization of the institution. Slaves were provided with only the minimum necessary for survival, and comfort was considered irrelevant. Heating was minimal, sanitation was poor, and overcrowding was common. These conditions were deliberately maintained to emphasize the slaves' low status and dependence on their owners. Diet and nutrition. The diet of enslaved people was carefully calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain productivity while minimizing costs. The Roman writer Cato the Elder provides detailed instructions for feeding slaves, recommending a basic diet of bread, wine, olives, and occasional meat. This diet was nutritionally adequate but monotonous and often insufficient for those engaged in heavy labor. Rural slaves typically received a monthly ration of grain, which they had to prepare themselves. This grain ration formed the basis of their diet, supplemented by whatever vegetables they could grow in small garden plots, if permitted. Olives and olive oil provided necessary fats, while watered wine served as the primary beverage. Fresh meat was rare and usually only provided during festivals or as a reward for good behavior. Urban slaves often had access to slightly more varied diets, as they could obtain scraps from their masters' tables or purchase additional food if they earned small amounts of money through tips or side work. However, even these slaves faced constant food insecurity and were entirely dependent on their owners' willingness to provide adequate nutrition. Malnutrition was common among enslaved populations, particularly affecting children and those engaged in the heaviest labor. Skeletal remains from ancient sites often show evidence of nutritional deficiencies, stunted growth, and diseases related to poor diet. The deliberate restriction of food also served as a method of control, as hungry slaves were less likely to resist and more dependent on their owners' goodwill. Clothing and personal possessions. Enslaved people were typically provided with basic, utilitarian clothing designed for durability rather than comfort or appearance. The Roman sources describe slaves wearing simple tunics made of coarse wool or linen, often in distinctive colors or styles that marked their status. These garments were replaced infrequently and were expected to last for years. The quality and quantity of clothing varied significantly based on the slave's role and the owner's wealth. Domestic slaves in wealthy households might receive better clothing to reflect well on their masters when appearing in public. Skilled slaves who interacted with free citizens or customers often dressed better than agricultural workers. However, even the best-dressed slaves wore clothing that clearly marked their status as non-free. Personal possessions were severely limited and technically belonged to the slave's owner. Slaves might accumulate small items through gifts, fines, or purchases made with peculium, small amounts of money they were allowed to keep, but these possessions could be confiscated at any time. The lack of personal property served as another reminder of their powerlessness and dependence. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters reveals that enslaved people did manage to acquire and keep small personal items, jewelry, religious amulets, gaming pieces, and small tools. These possessions, though few and simple, provided some sense of individual identity and personal agency within an otherwise dehumanizing system. The presence of religious objects suggests that spiritual life remained important to many enslaved individuals despite their circumstances. Work routines and labor patterns. The daily routine of enslaved people was structured entirely around their labor obligations, with work beginning before dawn and continuing until after dark. Agricultural slaves faced seasonal variations in their workload, with harvest times requiring especially long hours and intensive labor. Urban slaves might have more regular schedules but were expected to be available at all times to serve their master's needs. The concept of leisure time was largely foreign to enslaved people. Even during periods when specific tasks were not assigned, slaves were expected to remain available and useful. Domestic slaves might spend free time mending clothing, maintaining equipment, or performing maintenance tasks around the household. The idea of personal time or rest for its own sake was considered irrelevant to the slave condition. Work assignments were often determined by physical characteristics, skills, and the specific needs of the owner. Young, attractive slaves might be assigned to domestic service where they would be visible to guests and reflect well on the household. Strong individuals were typically assigned to heavy labor, while those with specialized skills might work as craftsmen or administrators. Women were often assigned to textile production, food preparation, or childcare. The intensity and nature of work varied significantly across different types of slavery. Household slaves might have relatively lighter physical demands but faced constant supervision and the unpredictable moods of their owners. Agricultural slaves endured backbreaking physical labor but might have more opportunities for social interaction with fellow slaves. The worst conditions were reserved for mining slaves and galley rowers, whose work was both extremely dangerous and physically devastating. Economic roles and occupations. Agricultural labor. Agriculture formed the backbone of ancient economies, and enslaved labor was central to agricultural production throughout the ancient world. Large estates, known as latifundia in Rome, relied almost entirely on slave labor for planting, cultivating, and harvesting crops. These agricultural slaves, known as servi rustici, formed the largest single category of enslaved people in most ancient societies. The work of agricultural slaves was physically demanding and seasonal. During planting and harvest seasons, slaves worked from dawn to dusk under constant supervision. The Roman agricultural writer Columella provides detailed descriptions of how slave gangs should be organized, emphasizing the importance of strict oversight and the use of chains to prevent escape. Field slaves were typically housed in barracks and fed basic rations calculated to maintain their productivity. Specialized agricultural roles included vine dressers, who required significant skill and experience to properly tend grapevines, and olive grove workers, who needed knowledge of pruning and harvesting techniques. These skilled agricultural slaves often received better treatment and might develop long-term relationships with specific estates. However, even skilled agricultural workers remained vulnerable to being sold or transferred if economic conditions changed. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that slaves might be idle during certain periods, leading to their use in construction projects, road building, or other infrastructure work during off-seasons. This flexibility made agricultural slaves valuable investments for large landowners who could utilize their labor year-round in various capacities. Livestock management was another crucial area where enslaved people worked as shepherds, goatherds, and cattle herders. These roles often involved traveling with animals to seasonal grazing areas, providing slaves with more freedom of movement but also greater isolation from other people. Pastoral slaves sometimes developed specialized knowledge of animal husbandry that made them particularly valuable. Domestic service. Domestic slaves formed the largest category of urban enslaved people and included a wide range of specialized roles within wealthy households. These slaves served as personal attendants, cooks, cleaners, doorkeepers, and entertainers. The relationship between domestic slaves and their owners was often more personal and complex than that of agricultural slaves, as they lived in close proximity and interacted daily. Personal attendants, known as capsarii or pediciqui, accompanied their owners throughout the day, carrying belongings, arranging appointments, and providing various services. These slaves often developed intimate knowledge of their owners' personal lives and business affairs, sometimes giving them influence despite their enslaved status. Female personal attendants might serve as ladies' maids, hairdressers, or companions, roles that required both skill and discretion. Kitchen slaves and cooks held important positions within households, as food preparation was a complex and time-consuming process in the ancient world. Skilled cooks were highly valued and might oversee teams of assistant cooks and food servers. The Roman wealthy competed to have the most elaborate meals, making talented kitchen slaves extremely valuable. Some cooks achieved such renown that they were lent or rented to other households for special occasions. Childcare was another crucial domestic role filled by enslaved people. Pedagogues and nurses were responsible for raising and educating the children of their owners, often developing strong emotional bonds with their charges. These relationships could provide some protection for the enslaved caregiver but also created complex emotional dynamics that could be exploited by owners. Doorkeepers and security slaves protected households and managed access to their owners. These positions required trustworthiness and good judgment, as they controlled who could enter the home. Porter slaves often became familiar figures in their neighborhoods and might develop relationships with free citizens who regularly visited the household. Entertainment slaves included musicians, dancers, actors, and storytellers who provided amusement for their owners and guests. These slaves often possessed considerable artistic talent and might achieve recognition beyond their owner's household. However, their entertainment value also made them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, particularly in the case of young and attractive performers. Craft and manufacturing. The ancient economy relied heavily on enslaved craftsmen who produced everything from pottery and textiles to metalwork and construction materials. These skilled slaves often worked in workshops alongside free artisans, creating complex social dynamics where enslaved individuals might be more skilled than their free counterparts but remained legally powerless. Textile production was dominated by enslaved women who spun, wove, and decorated fabrics for both household use and commercial sale. These women developed sophisticated skills in working with various fibers, creating complex patterns, and dyeing fabrics in desired colors. Textile workshops often employed dozens of enslaved women working under the supervision of a few free overseers. Metalworking slaves produced tools, weapons, jewelry, and household items. These craftsmen required years of training to develop their skills and represented significant investments for their owners. Skilled metal workers were often allowed to keep a portion of their earnings and might eventually purchase their freedom. However, they remained vulnerable to being sold or transferred if their owners' circumstances changed. Construction slaves built the monumental architecture that defined ancient cities. They quarried stone, moved massive building blocks, and provided the skilled labor necessary for complex engineering projects. The construction of major buildings like the Colosseum or the pyramids required thousands of workers, many of whom were enslaved. These projects often took decades to complete, meaning that some slaves spent their entire working lives on a single construction project. Pottery production employed large numbers of enslaved workers who shaped, fired, and decorated ceramic vessels. Archaeological evidence from pottery workshops reveals the scale of this industry and the specialization of different workers within the production process. Some enslaved potters achieved such skill that their work was sought after in distant markets, though the profits from their labor always belonged to their owners. Mining and heavy industry. Mining represented one of the most brutal forms of ancient slavery, combining extremely dangerous working conditions with deliberately harsh treatment designed to maximize short-term productivity. The silver mines at Laurium in Attica employed tens of thousands of enslaved workers who labored in narrow tunnels hundreds of feet underground, using primitive tools and working by lamplight. The working conditions in ancient mines were appalling. Slaves worked in spaces so narrow that they could barely stand upright, in temperatures that could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with poor ventilation that filled the air with toxic dust and gases. Cave-ins were common, and medical care was non-existent. The average life expectancy of a mining slave was estimated at just 2 to 3 years from the beginning of their underground work. Mining slaves were typically chained together to prevent escape and were supervised by brutal overseers who used whips and other weapons to maintain productivity. The isolation of mining operations, often located in remote mountainous areas, made escape virtually impossible even for unchained slaves. Those who attempted to flee faced death from exposure, wild animals, or pursuit by armed guards. The organization of mining operations reflected the disposable nature of mining slaves. Owners calculated that it was more profitable to work slaves to death and purchase replacements than to invest in better working conditions or longer-term productivity. This economic logic created some of the most horrific working conditions in the ancient world. Quarrying operations employed similar methods and faced similar conditions, though the work was conducted in the open air rather than underground. Slaves quarrying marble, granite, and other building stones used primitive tools to extract massive blocks, which they then had to move using human power alone. The precision required for quality stone cutting meant that some quarry slaves developed valuable skills, but the majority performed brutal manual labor under constant threat of punishment. Intellectual and administrative work. Not all enslaved people performed manual labor. Many ancient societies relied on enslaved individuals for intellectual and administrative tasks, including accounting, correspondence, teaching, and management. These slaves often came from conquered territories with strong educational traditions or were specifically trained for administrative roles. Scribal slaves were essential to the functioning of large households, businesses, and government operations. They maintained records, copied documents, and handled correspondence in multiple languages. The complexity of ancient record-keeping systems required considerable skill and training, making educated slaves extremely valuable. Some scribal slaves achieved positions of significant responsibility, managing vast estates or overseeing complex business operations. Teaching slaves, known as pedagogues, were responsible for educating the children of wealthy families. These individuals were often highly educated themselves, frequently coming from conquered Greek cities known for their intellectual traditions. The relationship between teaching slaves and their young charges was complex, as they provided moral and intellectual guidance while remaining in bondage themselves. Medical slaves served as doctors, surgeons, and healers throughout the ancient world. Many were trained in sophisticated medical techniques and achieved considerable skill in treating diseases and injuries. The contradiction of enslaved healers treating free patients created interesting social dynamics, as the medical knowledge possessed by these slaves was clearly valuable and respected even while their persons remained property. Administrative slaves managed complex business operations, including international trade, banking, and estate management. Some achieved such expertise that they effectively ran their owners' affairs with minimal oversight. These positions occasionally provided pathways to freedom and wealth, as successful slave administrators might accumulate sufficient peculium to purchase their manumission. Social relationships and family life. Family formation and separation. One of the most devastating aspects of slavery was its systematic destruction of family relationships. Enslaved people had no legal right to marry, and their relationships received no legal protection. Families could be separated at any time through sale, inheritance, or the whim of their owners. Despite these constraints, enslaved people formed deep emotional bonds and created family-like structures that provided crucial emotional support. Contubernium was the Roman term for slave relationships that resembled marriage but lacked legal status. These relationships were recognized by slave communities and sometimes by owners, but they provided no protection against separation. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters reveals family groupings and suggests that many enslaved people maintained stable relationships despite legal uncertainty. The separation of families was one of the most traumatic experiences in slave life. Children might be sold away from parents, spouses separated by hundreds of miles, and extended family networks destroyed. Roman law explicitly prohibited slaves from filing complaints about family separation, and owners faced no legal constraints on breaking up slave families. The psychological impact of these separations was enormous and created lasting trauma that affected entire slave communities. Some enslaved people managed to maintain family connections across great distances through informal networks and occasional visits. Letters preserved on papyrus reveal that some literate slaves corresponded with separated family members, though such communication was risky and depended on the cooperation of owners or sympathetic intermediaries. Despite the obstacles, enslaved people created strategies for protecting their children and maintaining family bonds. Some specialized slaves who traveled on business could carry messages between separated family members. Others saved money to eventually purchase the freedom of relatives. These efforts demonstrate the persistence of family loyalty and love despite the systematic attempts to destroy human bonds. The relationship between slaves and owners was complex and varied significantly based on individual personalities, economic circumstances, and cultural factors. While the fundamental relationship was one of domination and exploitation, daily interactions could range from brutal abuse to something approaching mutual respect, though always within the context of legal ownership. Some owners developed paternalistic attitudes toward their slaves, viewing themselves as benevolent protectors responsible for their slaves' welfare. This paternalism could result in better treatment, protection from abuse, and occasional rewards, but it also reinforced the power dynamic and justified the continuation of slavery. Paternalistic owners often expected gratitude and loyalty from their slaves in return for what they saw as kind treatment. The Roman legal system granted owners absolute power over their slaves, including the right to punish, sell, or kill them. This legal framework created relationships based fundamentally on fear, regardless of how individual owners chose to exercise their power. Even kind owners could change their treatment at any time, and slaves lived with constant awareness of their vulnerability. Sexual relationships between owners and slaves were common and entirely one-sided, as enslaved people had no right to refuse sexual demands. These relationships rarely involved affection or choice on the part of the enslaved person and often resulted in children who remained enslaved despite their mixed parentage. Some male slaves were castrated specifically to serve as safe attendants for women in wealthy households. Trust was a complicated issue in master-slave relationships. Owners needed to rely on slaves for important tasks while knowing that enslaved people had every reason to hate their masters. Some slaves developed genuine loyalty to kind owners, while others maintained facades of obedience while secretly planning resistance or escape. The constant uncertainty about slave loyalty created paranoia among owners and led to increasingly harsh control measures. Community and social networks. Despite the atomizing effects of slavery, enslaved people created robust social networks and community structures that provided emotional support, practical assistance, and collective resistance strategies. These communities often transcended individual households and included slaves from different owners who met at markets, festivals, or while performing errands. Religious communities were particularly important for enslaved people, as they provided spaces where slaves could interact as equals and maintain cultural traditions from their homelands. Many enslaved people maintained their ancestral religious practices or adopted new religions that offered hope and community. The spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire was partly facilitated by slave communities who found comfort in its message of spiritual equality. Mutual aid networks among slaves included systems for sharing resources, protecting vulnerable community members, and maintaining morale during difficult periods. These networks operated carefully to avoid detection by owners, but they provided crucial support for newly enslaved individuals, those facing punishment, and families dealing with separation. Language communities emerged among slaves who shared common origins. Greek slaves in Roman households often maintained their linguistic and cultural identity, creating informal networks that preserved traditions and provided emotional connections to their homeland. Similarly, Celtic, Germanic, and other ethnic groups among enslaved populations maintained cultural practices that strengthened community bonds. Professional networks developed among skilled slaves who worked in similar trades. These connections facilitated the exchange of technical knowledge, provided opportunities for collaboration on projects, and sometimes enabled slaves to earn additional income through freelance work. Such networks could also provide information about opportunities for manumission or escape. Romantic relationships and sexuality. Romantic relationships among enslaved people developed despite the legal and practical obstacles they faced. These relationships provided emotional support and human connection in circumstances designed to dehumanize and isolate individuals. However, they also created additional vulnerabilities, as loved ones could be used as leverage for control or punishment. The lack of legal marriage rights meant that slave couples had no protection against separation and no legal claim to their children. Despite this, many enslaved people formed lasting partnerships and worked together to protect their relationships. Some owners recognized slave partnerships and avoided separating couples, either from humanitarian motives or because stable relationships contributed to better behavior and productivity. Sexual exploitation was a constant threat for enslaved people, particularly women and children. Owners, overseers, and other authority figures could demand sexual services without consequence. The vulnerability of enslaved people to sexual abuse was one of the most dehumanizing aspects of the institution and created lasting trauma for individuals and communities. Some enslaved people, particularly attractive young men and women, were specifically purchased for sexual purposes. These individuals faced unique forms of exploitation and often had no other economic function beyond providing sexual services. The commodification of sexuality under slavery created markets in human beings specifically for sexual exploitation. Resistance to sexual exploitation took various forms, from outright refusal, which could result in severe punishment or death, to more subtle forms of non-cooperation. Some enslaved people formed protective relationships with other slaves or even sympathetic free individuals who could provide some defense against unwanted advances. Resistance, rebellion, and escape. Individual acts of resistance. Resistance to slavery took many forms, from subtle acts of non-cooperation to dramatic escape attempts and violent rebellion. Individual resistance was the most common form, as enslaved people found countless ways to assert their humanity and resist total domination. These acts of resistance required courage and creativity, as they were carried out under constant surveillance and threat of severe punishment. Work slowdowns and sabotage were common forms of daily resistance. Slaves might work deliberately slowly, damage tools or equipment, or perform tasks incorrectly to frustrate their owners and assert some control over their labor. These actions had to be subtle enough to avoid detection while still providing psychological satisfaction and practical disruption. Theft was another widespread form of resistance, as slaves appropriated food, clothing, tools, or other items from their owners. This theft served both practical and symbolic purposes. It provided needed resources while also challenging the owner's absolute control over property. The Roman legal system recognized that slave theft was so common as to be inevitable, leading to legal provisions that assumed slaves would steal from their masters. Cultural resistance involved maintaining traditions, languages, and religious practices from enslaved people's homelands despite efforts to eliminate these connections. Enslaved individuals secretly taught their children ancestral languages, practiced traditional crafts, and preserved stories and songs that connected them to their pre-enslavement identities. This cultural preservation was a form of spiritual resistance that maintained human dignity in dehumanizing circumstances. Running away was the most direct form of individual resistance, though it was extremely dangerous and rarely successful. Escaped slaves faced pursuit by professional slave catchers, legal penalties for anyone who assisted them, and the constant threat of recapture. Most escape attempts occurred within the first few months of enslavement, before individuals became psychologically adapted to their circumstances or geographically familiar with escape routes. Organized rebellions. Large-scale slave rebellions were relatively rare but had enormous impact when they occurred. The most famous ancient slave rebellion was led by Spartacus in 73 to 71 BCE, when an estimated 70,000 enslaved people joined a revolt that threatened Roman control of southern Italy. This rebellion demonstrated both the potential for organized slave resistance and the extreme violence with which such resistance was suppressed. The Spartacus rebellion began in a gladiator school in Capua and initially involved fewer than 100 individuals. However, it quickly attracted agricultural slaves from throughout the region who saw an opportunity to escape their bondage. The rebellion's growth revealed the widespread discontent among enslaved populations and the organizational capabilities of enslaved leaders. Earlier rebellions in Sicily had also demonstrated the potential for large-scale slave resistance. The First and Second Servile Wars in the 2nd century BC involved tens of thousands of enslaved people who established temporary independent territories and challenged Roman military power. These rebellions were ultimately crushed, but they forced Roman authorities to recognize that slavery created inherent instabilities in their society. The organization of slave rebellions required sophisticated planning and leadership. Successful rebellions needed to coordinate action across multiple locations, maintain secrecy during planning phases, and develop military strategies for confronting professional armies. The ability of enslaved people to accomplish these complex tasks contradicted stereotypes about their supposed inferiority and demonstrated their intelligence and capabilities. The suppression of slave rebellions was invariably brutal, with captured rebels facing crucifixion, torture, and other extreme punishments designed to deter future resistance. After the Spartacus Rebellion, 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning to other potential rebels. This extreme violence was intended to create terror and discourage resistance. Escape networks and underground support. Despite the legal prohibitions and severe penalties, some free individuals and communities provided assistance to escaping slaves. These informal networks were necessarily secretive and limited, but they provided crucial support for successful escape attempts. Understanding these networks requires careful analysis of scattered references in ancient sources and archaeological evidence. Urban environments offered both opportunities and challenges for escaped slaves. Cities provided anonymity and potential employment, but they also had sophisticated systems for identifying and capturing fugitives. Escaped slaves might find temporary shelter in temples, which traditionally provided sanctuary, or in the homes of sympathetic free individuals who were willing to risk legal penalties. Border regions and frontier areas offered the best opportunities for permanent escape, as they were often beyond the effective reach of slave catchers and might have populations sympathetic to refugees. Some escaped slaves joined barbarian tribes or established communities in remote areas where they could live as free individuals. However, these regions were also dangerous due to warfare, wild animals, and harsh living conditions. Professional slave catchers, known as fugitivarii in Rome, specialized in tracking and capturing escaped slaves. These individuals used dogs, informants, and systematic search methods to locate fugitives. The existence of professional slave catchers demonstrates both the frequency of escape attempts and the determination of owners to recover their property. Religious communities sometimes provided assistance to escaped slaves, though this was risky and controversial. Some early Christian communities included both slaves and free members, creating opportunities for assistance and shelter. However, religious leaders were generally careful not to openly challenge the institution of slavery, as this would have brought persecution and destruction of their communities. Psychological and cultural resistance. Beyond physical resistance, enslaved people developed sophisticated psychological strategies for maintaining their humanity and resisting the dehumanizing effects of slavery. These forms of resistance were often invisible to owners but were crucial for individual and community survival. Maintaining ancestral names and identities was one form of psychological resistance. While owners typically assigned new names to their slaves, enslaved communities often secretly preserved original names and passed them down to children. This practice maintained connections to pre-enslavement identities and resisted the owner's attempt to completely control their slaves' sense of self. Storytelling and oral traditions provided another form of cultural resistance. Enslaved people preserved and adapted traditional stories, songs, and folklore that maintain connections to their ancestral cultures. These traditions also provided moral frameworks and examples of resistance that could inspire hope and guide behavior. Religious syncretism allowed enslaved people to maintain spiritual practices while appearing to conform to their owners' religious requirements. By blending ancestral religious traditions with locally dominant religions, slaves could maintain spiritual connections to their homelands while avoiding punishment for nonconformity. Secret communication systems developed within slave communities allowed for the sharing of information about opportunities, dangers, and resistance strategies. These might include coded language, symbolic markers, or gestural systems that allowed enslaved people to communicate without detection by overseers. Such systems were particularly important for coordinating collective action or sharing information about escape opportunities. Regional variations in slavery. Greek city-states. Slavery in ancient Greece varied significantly between different city-states, though all Greek societies relied heavily on enslaved labor. Athens, our best documented example, had a slave population that may have equaled or exceeded the free population at its height. These slaves worked in mines, workshops, households, and public projects, forming an essential component of Athenian economic and social life. Athenian slaves included both privately owned individuals and public slaves owned by the city-state. Public slaves worked on infrastructure projects, served as secretaries and clerks for government offices, and provided various municipal services. These public slaves often had better working conditions than privately owned slaves and sometimes achieved positions of considerable responsibility within the Athenian administration. The treatment of slaves in Athens was regulated by law to some extent, with prohibitions against the most extreme forms of abuse and provisions for slaves to seek sanctuary in temples if they faced life-threatening mistreatment. However, these protections were limited and difficult to enforce, as slaves had no legal standing to file complaints themselves. Spartan slavery, embodied in the Helot system, represented a unique form of ethnic bondage where entire populations were enslaved to serve the Spartan state. Helots were primarily Messenians who had been conquered and enslaved collectively, maintaining their ethnic identity while being forced to provide agricultural labor for Spartan citizens. This system created constant tension and occasional rebellions that shaped Spartan military and social institutions. The Helot system differed from other forms of Greek slavery in that Helots maintained some community structure and cultural identity. They lived in their traditional territories and continued to speak their native language and practice their customs, though under Spartan domination. This partial preservation of community made Helots potentially more dangerous to their masters but also provided them with stronger social support networks. Other Greek city-states developed their own variations of slavery. Corinth was famous for its large population of skilled slave craftsmen who produced luxury goods for export. These slaves often worked with considerable independence and might accumulate significant wealth, though they remained legally enslaved. The island of Chios was notorious for its harsh treatment of slaves and its role as a major slave trading center. Roman Empire. Roman slavery was the most extensive and systematically organized form of ancient slavery, with enslaved people forming perhaps 30% of the population in Italy during the height of the empire. The Roman legal system provided detailed regulations governing every aspect of slave life, from sale and ownership to punishment and manumission. The scale of Roman slavery was unprecedented in the ancient world. Major Roman households might own hundreds of slaves, while wealthy landowners could possess thousands. The Roman state itself owned vast numbers of slaves who worked on public projects, in government offices, and in imperial workshops. This massive slave population was essential to Roman economic prosperity and military expansion. Roman slaves were categorized into numerous specialized roles, creating complex hierarchies within enslaved populations. Urban slaves, servi urbani, generally had better conditions than rural slaves, servi rustici, while imperial slaves, servi caesaris, who worked directly for the emperor often achieved positions of considerable power and influence. The Roman villa system created distinct environments for slave life. Large agricultural estates employed hundreds of slaves organized into work gangs under the supervision of slave overseers called villaci. These estates were often self-sufficient communities that included workshops, living quarters, and even burial grounds for enslaved workers. The isolation of rural villas made escape difficult but also created opportunities for slaves to develop semi-autonomous communities. Roman law governing slavery was extraordinarily detailed and harsh. The 12 Tables and subsequent legislation established that slaves were property, res, rather than persons, with no legal rights or protections. Masters could punish slaves however they chose, including torture and execution. The only legal limitation was that owners could not kill slaves without reason, though reason was broadly interpreted. The practice of gladiatorial combat represented a unique aspect of Roman slavery, where enslaved fighters were trained to kill each other for public entertainment. Gladiator schools like the one in Capua that produced Spartacus created specialized communities of enslaved warriors who lived under military discipline while preparing for mortal combat. Some gladiators achieved fame and wealth, but they remained enslaved and faced constant risk of death. Roman funeral practices reveal the complex relationships between slaves and owners. Some tombstones commemorate favorite slaves with affectionate inscriptions, while others simply record slaves as property inventories. The variation in these memorials reflects the range of relationships that could develop within the fundamental inequality of the slave system. Ancient Egypt. Egyptian slavery differed significantly from Greek and Roman practices, though it remained a central institution in Egyptian society. The Egyptian economy relied heavily on enslaved labor for construction projects, agricultural work, and domestic service, but Egyptian slaves often had more opportunities for social mobility than their counterparts in other ancient societies. The construction of pyramids and other monumental architecture required enormous labor forces that included both enslaved workers and conscripted free citizens. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that pyramid builders received better treatment than previously believed, with adequate food, medical care, and decent housing. However, this evidence primarily relates to skilled workers, while the experiences of unskilled slave laborers remain less clear. Egyptian household slavery was particularly well documented through papyrus records that reveal daily life in wealthy homes. These documents show that domestic slaves performed specialized roles including cooking, cleaning, childcare, and entertainment. Egyptian slave owners seem to have been more likely to free their slaves than owners in other societies, though this may reflect the survival of more complete records rather than genuinely different practices. The Nubian slave trade provided Egypt with a steady supply of enslaved workers from the south. Egyptian military campaigns regularly captured Nubian prisoners who were then transported north to work in Egyptian mines, fields, and households. These slaves faced additional challenges as they were often from very different cultural backgrounds and had to adapt to Egyptian language and customs while adjusting to enslaved status. Temple slavery was a unique feature of Egyptian society, where enslaved people worked for religious institutions rather than private individuals. These temple slaves might have slightly better conditions and more stable situations than privately owned slaves, as temples were permanent institutions less likely to sell or mistreat their workers. However, temple slaves remained property and faced many of the same restrictions as other enslaved people. Egyptian attitudes toward slavery were influenced by religious beliefs about the afterlife and social order. Some evidence suggests that Egyptians believed slavery could continue into the afterlife, with enslaved people serving their masters even in death. This belief system reinforced the permanent nature of slave status and made resistance more difficult by extending bondage beyond death. Mesopotamian civilizations. Mesopotamian societies, including Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria, developed some of the earliest systematic forms of slavery in human history. The Code of Hammurabi and other legal documents from these civilizations provide detailed insights into the regulation and practice of slavery in the ancient Near East. Mesopotamian slavery was closely tied to debt and economic relationships. Many individuals became enslaved through inability to repay loans, creating a system where economic misfortune could lead to permanent bondage. The Code of Hammurabi provided some protections for debt slaves, including limitations on the length of service and provisions for family members, but these protections were often inadequate in practice. Palace slavery was a distinctive feature of Mesopotamian societies, where large numbers of enslaved people worked in royal complexes performing specialized crafts, administrative duties, and personal services. These palace slaves often developed valuable skills and might achieve positions of influence within royal administrations. However, they remained completely dependent on royal favor and could be severely punished or executed for any perceived disloyalty. Temple slavery was also significant in Mesopotamian societies, with religious institutions owning large numbers of enslaved workers. These slaves worked temple lands, maintained religious buildings, and performed ritual functions. The integration of slavery into religious practice helped legitimize the institution by connecting it to divine order and cosmic hierarchy. Mesopotamian military campaigns regularly produced large numbers of enslaved captives who were distributed among soldiers, sold in markets, or assigned to royal projects. The Assyrian Empire, in particular, was known for its systematic enslavement of conquered populations and the transportation of enslaved people throughout the empire to prevent organized resistance. The urban workshops of Mesopotamian cities employed significant numbers of skilled slaves who produced textiles, metalwork, pottery, and other manufactured goods. These workshops often included both free and enslaved workers, creating complex social dynamics where skill and productivity could partially transcend legal status. However, enslaved craftsmen remained vulnerable to sale or transfer regardless of their contributions. Persian Empire. The Persian Empire's approach to slavery reflected its vast diversity and administrative complexity. Different regions within the empire maintained their traditional slavery practices while also adapting to Persian imperial requirements. This created a patchwork of slavery systems that varied significantly across the empire's territories. Persian royal households employed thousands of enslaved people in various capacities, from personal attendants and guards to skilled craftsmen and administrators. The scale of royal slavery was enormous, with some Persian palaces employing more enslaved people than the entire populations of many cities. These royal slaves often came from throughout the empire and brought diverse skills and cultural backgrounds to court life. The Persian military made extensive use of enslaved people as support personnel, though enslaved individuals were generally not used as frontline soldiers. Slave laborers built and maintained military infrastructure, transported supplies, and provided various services to Persian armies. Some enslaved people achieved positions as military engineers or administrators, though they remained under the control of Persian officers. Persian administrative practices created opportunities for some enslaved people to achieve positions of responsibility within the imperial bureaucracy. The empire's size and complexity required large numbers of literate administrators, and qualified slaves might be assigned to important posts while remaining legally enslaved. This created a class of highly educated and influential slaves who wielded considerable power despite their bondage. The Persian policy of religious tolerance meant that enslaved people from different cultural backgrounds could often maintain their religious practices while serving Persian masters. This tolerance may have reduced some of the cultural trauma associated with enslavement, though it did not address the fundamental injustices of the system. Trade slavery was particularly important in the Persian Empire due to its position at the crossroads of major trade routes. Persian merchants dealt in enslaved people from Africa, Central Asia, the Mediterranean, and India, creating some of the most cosmopolitan slave populations in the ancient world. This diversity of origins meant that Persian slave communities often included individuals from vastly different cultural backgrounds. Gender and age in ancient slavery. Women's experiences. Enslaved women faced unique vulnerabilities and challenges that distinguished their experiences from those of male slaves. Sexual exploitation was a constant threat that affected every aspect of their lives, from their initial purchase and assignment to their daily interactions with owners, overseers, and other authority figures. This sexual vulnerability was explicitly recognized in ancient slave markets, where young women commanded higher prices specifically because of their potential for sexual exploitation. Reproductive slavery was a particular horror faced by enslaved women, who were often deliberately bred to produce more slaves. Roman law explicitly stated that children born to enslaved mothers belonged to the mother's owner, creating economic incentives for forced reproduction. Enslaved women had no control over their reproductive choices and might be assigned sexual partners specifically to produce children who would become valuable property. Domestic work assignments often placed enslaved women in positions of particular vulnerability within households. As personal attendants, cooks, and cleaners, they worked in close proximity to male family members and had little protection against abuse. The privacy of household settings meant that abuse often went unwitnessed and unreported, leaving enslaved women with no recourse against mistreatment. Some enslaved women achieved positions of influence within households, particularly as nurses and tutors for children. These relationships could provide some protection and stability, as women who successfully raised valued children might receive preferential treatment. However, such positions also created emotional vulnerabilities, as enslaved women might become attached to children who could be used as leverage against them. Skilled enslaved women worked as weavers, seamstresses, hairdressers, and in other specialized trades that required training and experience. These skills could provide some protection against the worst forms of abuse and might create opportunities for earning money through freelance work. However, skilled women remained vulnerable to sexual exploitation and had no legal protections for their earnings or working conditions. The experience of motherhood under slavery was particularly tragic, as enslaved mothers had no legal rights to their children and lived with constant fear of family separation. Roman law specifically denied slave mothers any parental authority, and children could be sold away from their mothers at any age. This legal framework created profound trauma for enslaved women who were forced to raise children they could not protect. Children in slavery. Children born into slavery or enslaved at young ages faced unique challenges and opportunities within ancient slave systems. Their experiences were shaped by their developmental needs, potential for training, and value to owners who could mold them for specific purposes from an early age. Very young slaves, particularly those under age 7, were often kept with their mothers if practical considerations allowed. This early period might be the only time enslaved children experienced anything resembling normal family relationships. However, economic pressures and owner preferences frequently led to early separation, causing severe trauma for both children and parents. Training and education of enslaved children began early and was designed to maximize their economic value to owners. Children who showed intelligence might be taught to read and write, preparing them for administrative or secretarial roles. Those who demonstrated artistic ability could be trained as musicians, dancers, or entertainers. Physical strength and attractive appearance might lead to training as personal attendants or guards. The Roman practice of using child slaves as sexual objects was widespread and legally sanctioned. Young slaves of both genders were vulnerable to sexual exploitation, and some were specifically purchased for this purpose. The powerlessness of enslaved children made them particularly vulnerable to abuse, and they had no legal protections or recourse against mistreatment. Education of enslaved children often exceeded that available to free children from poor families, creating the paradox of enslaved individuals who were more literate and skilled than their social superiors. This education was provided solely to increase the slave's economic value, but it also gave some enslaved people tools they could use for resistance or eventual self-advancement. Child labor was common and often involved dangerous or unhealthy conditions. Young slaves worked in workshops, fields, and mines, performing tasks that their small size and agility made them suitable for. Child slaves in mines were often assigned to crawl through narrow tunnels that adults could not navigate, exposing them to cave-ins, toxic gases, and other deadly hazards. The psychological development of children under slavery was profoundly affected by their circumstances. Those who grew up enslaved often internalized their status and developed survival strategies based on compliance and adaptation. However, archaeological and literary evidence suggests that many enslaved children also developed strong resistance identities and maintained hope for eventual freedom. Elderly slaves. Aging slaves faced particular vulnerabilities as their economic value decreased and their ability to perform demanding labor diminished. Unlike free citizens who might expect care from family members in old age, enslaved people had no guarantee of support and were entirely dependent on their owners' willingness to maintain them. The economic logic of slavery created strong incentives for owners to dispose of slaves who were no longer productive. Some elderly slaves were simply abandoned to die, while others might be sold to owners who specialized in extracting final value from aging workers. The fear of abandonment in old age was a constant source of anxiety for enslaved people throughout their lives. However, some elderly slaves achieved positions of respect and relative security within their communities. Those who had served faithful for many years might be retained as advisors, trainers for younger slaves, or light-duty workers. Elderly slaves often became repositories of institutional knowledge about household routines, craft techniques, or estate management that made them valuable despite their reduced physical capabilities. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, sometimes occurred when slaves became too old to work effectively, though this was often motivated more by the owner's desire to avoid supporting unproductive individuals than by humanitarian concerns. Elderly freed slaves faced their own challenges, as they had to support themselves without resources or family support networks. The wisdom and experience of elderly slaves were often valued by younger enslaved people, who looked to them for guidance on survival strategies, craft skills, and cultural traditions. These informal mentoring relationships helped preserve knowledge and provided emotional support within slave communities, though they had to be conducted carefully to avoid appearing as potential sources of resistance organization. Some elderly slaves achieved quasi-parental roles within their communities, providing guidance and support to younger enslaved people who had been separated from their biological families. These relationships partially filled the gap left by the systematic destruction of family structures, though they could never fully compensate for the loss of genuine family connections. Legal status and rights. Legal definitions and categories. Ancient legal systems universally classified slaves as property rather than persons, though the specific legal frameworks varied between cultures. Roman law, the most thoroughly documented system, defined slaves as res, things, that could be bought, sold, inherited, and disposed of at their owner's discretion. This legal classification had profound implications for every aspect of slave life and established the framework within which all slave-owner relationships operated. The Roman legal concept of dominica potestas granted masters absolute power over their slaves, including the right to punish, sell, or kill them. This power was legally unlimited, though social pressure and economic considerations might influence how it was exercised. The law explicitly stated that anything a slave acquired automatically belonged to their master, meaning that enslaved people could never legally own property or accumulate wealth. Different categories of slaves had varying legal status even within the same society. Public slaves, servi publici, in Rome had slightly different legal standing than privately owned slaves, as they served the state rather than individual masters. Imperial slaves, servi caesaris, who worked for the emperor occupied a unique position that sometimes provided them with influence and protection despite their enslaved status. Gladiator slaves existed in a special legal category that combined elements of military service with entertainment. While still enslaved, gladiators were subject to specific regulations governing their training, fighting, and potential freedom. The popularity of gladiatorial games created economic incentives for better treatment of successful fighters, though they remained property throughout their careers. Foreign slaves often faced additional legal restrictions based on their origins. Those from territories that had rebelled against Rome might be subject to permanent enslavement with no possibility of manumission. Conversely, slaves from allied territories might have slightly better legal standing and greater opportunities for eventual freedom. The legal system provided minimal protections for slaves, and these were primarily designed to protect owners' property rights rather than slaves' welfare. Laws against killing or severely injuring another person's slave were intended to protect the owner's investment, not to safeguard the slave's life. Similarly, regulations governing slave sales focused on preventing fraud against purchasers rather than protecting enslaved people from abuse. Punishments and legal penalties. The punishment of slaves was regulated more by custom and practical considerations than by legal restrictions. Roman law permitted masters to use any form of punishment they deemed appropriate, including torture, mutilation, and execution. This unlimited power of punishment was seen as essential to maintaining order and discipline within slave populations. Physical punishment was routine and expected in slave management. Whipping was the most common form of punishment, administered for infractions ranging from work slowdowns to attempted escape. Archaeological evidence reveals that many slaves bore permanent scars from repeated beatings, and some skeletons show evidence of healed fractures consistent with violent punishment. Crucifixion was reserved for the most serious offenses, particularly rebellion or escape attempts. This form of execution was deliberately designed to be slow, painful, and public, serving as a deterrent to other potential resistors. The crucifixion of thousands of rebels after the Spartacus rebellion demonstrated the state's willingness to use extreme violence to maintain the slavery system. Branding and tattooing were used to mark slaves permanently, particularly those who had attempted to escape or committed serious offenses. These marks served both to identify fugitive slaves and to shame individuals within slave communities. Some brands indicated specific crimes, while others simply marked the individual as untrustworthy or dangerous. Imprisonment in ergastula, slave prisons, was another common punishment for serious offenses. These facilities were designed to be deliberately harsh, with inadequate food, poor sanitation, and constant chains. Slaves might be imprisoned for months or years, emerging weakened and broken in spirit. The threat of ergastula imprisonment was used to control entire slave populations. The law of retaliation allowed masters to punish groups of slaves for individual offenses, creating collective responsibility that encouraged slaves to police each other's behavior. If one slave committed a serious crime, their fellow slaves might face punishment as well, creating internal pressure against resistance activities. Legal testimony and court proceedings. Slaves had no legal standing in ancient courts and could not testify in legal proceedings unless they were tortured, based on the assumption that enslaved people would only tell the truth under extreme duress. This legal principle, known as quaestio per tormenta in Roman law, meant that slave testimony was only accepted if obtained through torture. The torture of slave witnesses was conducted using specialized equipment and techniques designed to produce maximum pain while keeping the victim alive and capable of speech. These procedures were legally regulated to ensure that the torture was severe enough to guarantee truthfulness but not so extreme as to kill the witness before testimony was complete. The requirement for torture before slave testimony created additional trauma for enslaved people who were already victims of crimes or disputes. Slaves who witnessed crimes or had information relevant to legal cases faced the terrible choice between remaining silent and enduring torture to provide testimony. This system also discouraged slaves from reporting crimes or seeking legal protection. Some legal cases involved disputes over slave ownership, sale contracts, or damages caused by slaves. In these proceedings, enslaved people were treated as objects of dispute rather than parties with interests. They could not advocate for themselves or choose which master they preferred, even when ownership was contested. The legal system occasionally provided minimal protections for slaves in cases of extreme abuse, though these protections were difficult to invoke and rarely effective. Slaves who fled to temples seeking sanctuary might receive temporary protection, but they had no legal mechanism for permanently escaping abusive owners through court action. Legal documents reveal that some slaves achieved informal recognition as skilled professionals despite their legal status as property. Slave doctors, teachers, and craftsmen might be referenced in contracts and legal documents in ways that acknowledge their expertise, though this recognition provided no legal protections or rights. Economic aspects of slavery. The slave trade and markets. The ancient slave trade was a sophisticated commercial enterprise that connected distant regions and involved complex networks of traders, transporters, and financiers. Major slave markets operated in cities throughout the Mediterranean and Near East, with some specializing in particular types of slaves or serving specific regional demands. The port of Delos in the Aegean Sea was perhaps the largest slave market in the ancient world, reportedly capable of handling 10,000 slave sales in a single day. This market served buyers from throughout the Mediterranean and facilitated the distribution of enslaved people from diverse origins to destinations across the Roman Empire. The scale of operations at Delos demonstrates the enormous scope of the ancient slave trade. Slave prices varied dramatically based on age, gender, skills, physical appearance, and origin. Young, attractive, and skilled slaves commanded the highest prices, while older or less desirable individuals might sell for minimal amounts. Specialized slaves like doctors, teachers, or entertainers could cost as much as several years' wages for ordinary free workers, making them luxury purchases for wealthy buyers. The financing of slave purchases involved complex credit arrangements and investment partnerships. Wealthy individuals might pool resources to purchase large numbers of slaves for specific projects, while others borrowed money secured by their existing slave holdings. These financial arrangements created webs of economic relationships that tied the prosperity of free citizens directly to the continuation of slavery. Transportation of slaves involved specialized ships, overland caravans, and holding facilities designed to move human cargo efficiently while minimizing losses from death or escape. The mortality rate during transportation was significant, particularly for long-distance journeys, leading traders to purchase more slaves than they expected to deliver alive. Regional specialization developed within the slave trade, with certain areas becoming known for producing particular types of slaves. Thrace was famous for supplying gladiators and soldiers, while educated Greeks were sought after as teachers and administrators. Celtic regions provided agricultural workers, while Africa supplied both skilled craftsmen and heavy laborers. Quality control in slave markets involved detailed inspections and warranties that treated human beings as manufactured goods. Buyers could return slaves who proved to have hidden defects or diseases, and sellers provided guarantees about slaves' skills, health, and behavioral characteristics. These commercial practices further dehumanized enslaved people by reducing them to economic commodities. Economic value and investment. Slaves represented major capital investments for their owners, often constituting the largest component of wealthy individuals' asset portfolios. A skilled slave might cost as much as a house or small farm, making careful management essential for protecting these investments. This economic logic influenced treatment patterns, as owners sought to maintain their slaves' productivity while minimizing maintenance costs. The return on investment from slave ownership varied significantly based on the slave's skills, health, and work assignment. Skilled craftsmen and educated slaves might generate substantial income for their owners through their specialized work, while agricultural slaves provided steady but modest returns through their labor. Mining slaves generated high short-term profits but required frequent replacement due to high mortality rates. Depreciation of slave value was a constant concern for owners, as slaves aged, became injured, or lost their skills. Unlike other forms of property, slaves required ongoing maintenance costs for food, housing, and medical care throughout their lives. The economic pressure to maximize returns before slaves became unproductive contributed to harsh working conditions and neglect of long-term health needs. Some owners engaged in slave breeding as a business strategy, viewing enslaved women primarily as producers of future slaves. This practice was most common on large agricultural estates where owners could control slave relationships and raise children specifically for sale or use. The breeding of slaves created additional trauma for enslaved families while providing owners with renewable sources of human property. Insurance and risk management for slave ownership included various strategies to protect against losses from death, injury, or escape. Wealthy owners might diversify their slave holdings across different locations and types of work to minimize risks. Some formed partnerships that shared both the costs and benefits of slave ownership, spreading risks across multiple investors. The economic impact of manumission was carefully calculated by owners who had to balance the cost of supporting aging slaves against the potential benefits of freeing them. Some owners freed slaves who had become unproductive to avoid ongoing maintenance costs, while others used the promise of freedom as an incentive to maintain productivity during slaves' working years. The economics of slave labor were based on the principle of extracting maximum productivity while minimizing costs, creating systematic incentives for harsh treatment and overwork. Unlike free workers who could demand better conditions or change employment, slaves had no bargaining power and could be forced to work regardless of their preferences or physical condition. Productivity measurements for slave labor were sophisticated and detailed, with owners tracking output per worker and adjusting assignments to maximize efficiency. Roman agricultural writers like Columella provided detailed calculations for optimal slave-to-land ratios and expected productivity levels for different types of agricultural work. These calculations treated enslaved people as production units rather than human beings. The specialization of slave labor created complex hierarchies and interdependencies within large operations. A single Roman villa might employ dozens of slaves in specialized roles ranging from field workers and craftsmen to administrators and guards. This specialization increased overall productivity but also created vulnerabilities if key skilled slaves were lost through death, injury, or escape. Competition between slave-owning enterprises drove innovations in slave management and work organization. Owners experimented with different incentive systems, punishment regimes, and organizational structures to optimize their returns. Some developed relatively sophisticated human resource management practices, though always within the context of treating people as property. The economic efficiency of slave labor was debated even in ancient times, with some observers noting that free workers might be more motivated and productive than enslaved ones. However, the availability of cheap slaves through conquest and trade generally made slave labor more profitable than free labor for most applications, particularly for unskilled work. Seasonal variations in labor demand created challenges for slave owners who had to maintain their workforce year-round while productivity fluctuated. Some owners rented out slaves during periods when their primary work was not needed, while others used slack periods for maintenance projects or additional training. Religion and spirituality. Religious practices and beliefs. Religion provided enslaved people with one of the few areas of life where they could maintain some autonomy and cultural identity. While owners often attempted to control their slaves' religious practices, the private nature of spiritual belief made complete control impossible. Enslaved people used religion as a source of comfort, resistance, and community solidarity in ways that helped them survive the dehumanizing effects of bondage. Traditional religious practices from slaves' homelands were often maintained in secret, despite prohibitions or pressure to adopt the religion of their masters. Celtic slaves in Roman households might secretly honor their traditional deities, while Egyptian slaves maintained connections to their ancestral gods through private rituals and amulets. These practices provided psychological connections to their pre-enslavement identities and cultures. The adoption of new religious practices by enslaved people often involved syncretism, where traditional beliefs were blended with locally dominant religions to create hybrid spiritual systems. This allowed slaves to appear to conform to their masters' religious expectations while maintaining meaningful connections to their ancestral traditions. Such religious syncretism became a form of cultural resistance that preserved enslaved people's heritage. Mystery religions and secret cults were particularly attractive to enslaved people because they offered spiritual equality and community membership that transcended social status. Cults like those of Mithras, Dionysus, and later Christianity provided spaces where slaves could interact as spiritual equals with free citizens. However, participation in such religions was dangerous if discovered by hostile owners. Prayer and ritual practices provided enslaved people with methods for coping with trauma, maintaining hope, and seeking spiritual intervention in their circumstances. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters reveals religious artifacts, shrine areas, and burial practices that demonstrate the continued importance of spirituality in slave life. These practices often had to be conducted secretly to avoid punishment. Religious festivals and holy days sometimes provided temporary relief from work and opportunities for community gathering. Even when slaves were required to participate in their master's religious observances, these occasions might offer chances for social interaction and cultural expression that were otherwise forbidden. Some enslaved people found ways to incorporate their own spiritual meanings into required religious activities. Death and burial practices. The death and burial of enslaved people reflected their marginal legal status while revealing the persistence of human dignity and community solidarity even in bondage. Most slaves received minimal burial rites and were interred in simple graves with few or no grave goods. However, archaeological evidence reveals that slave communities often maintained their own burial practices and mourning rituals despite legal restrictions. Mass graves and potters' fields were common burial places for slaves, particularly those who died while performing heavy labor or during epidemic diseases. These burial sites often contained hundreds of bodies interred with minimal ceremony and no individual markers. The impersonal nature of these burials was intended to reinforce the disposable nature of slave life. Some slaves, particularly those who had served in wealthy households for extended periods, received more elaborate burials that reflected their relationships with their owners or fellow slaves. Tombstone inscriptions reveal that some masters commemorated favorite slaves with monuments and epitaphs that expressed genuine affection, though these relationships remained fundamentally unequal. Slave communities developed their own funeral practices that honored their dead and maintained cultural traditions despite legal limitations. These might include secret burial rituals, the creation of memorial objects, or the preservation of stories about deceased community members. Such practices provided comfort to the living while asserting the fundamental humanity of enslaved people. The burial of children was particularly poignant, as slave communities struggled to honor young lives cut short by disease, abuse, or harsh working conditions. Archaeological evidence reveals that enslaved parents sometimes managed to provide their children with small grave goods or special burial locations despite their poverty and legal restrictions. Religious beliefs about the afterlife provided comfort and meaning for enslaved people facing death. Some believed that death would bring freedom from bondage and reunion with separated family members. Others maintained traditional beliefs about ancestral spirits or adopted new religious frameworks that promised eventual justice and redemption. Religious leadership and community organization. Within slave communities, informal religious leadership often emerged despite the lack of official recognition or legal authority. These spiritual leaders provided guidance, conducted rituals, and maintained religious traditions that sustained community morale and cultural identity. Such leadership required considerable courage, as religious activities could be interpreted as potential sources of resistance organization. The preservation of oral traditions was a crucial function of religious leadership in slave communities. Stories, songs, and ritual practices were passed down through generations of enslaved people, maintaining connections to ancestral cultures and providing frameworks for understanding their circumstances. These oral traditions often contained coded messages about resistance strategies and community values. Religious leaders in slave communities sometimes achieved recognition beyond their immediate circles, becoming known for their wisdom, healing abilities, or spiritual insights. This recognition could provide some protection against harsh treatment, as even masters might value the services of a respected spiritual leader. However, such prominence also created risks if authorities viewed religious leadership as a threat to social order. The integration of enslaved people into established religious communities created complex social dynamics. In some cases, religious congregations included both free and enslaved members, creating spaces where normal social hierarchies were temporarily suspended. However, these religious communities rarely challenged the institution of slavery directly, as this would have brought persecution and destruction. Christian communities in the later Roman Empire included significant numbers of enslaved people, though early Christian leaders generally accepted slavery while preaching spiritual equality. This created tensions between Christian teachings about human dignity and the practical acceptance of human bondage that influenced the development of Christian theology and practice. Secret religious societies and burial associations provided enslaved people with organizational structures that supported community solidarity and mutual aid. These groups might pool resources to purchase freedom for members, provide support for families of deceased slaves, or maintain religious sites and practices. Such organizations had to operate carefully to avoid suspicion of seditious activity. Health and medical care. Disease and medical conditions. The health conditions of enslaved people were generally poor due to inadequate nutrition, harsh working environments, overcrowded living conditions, and minimal medical care. Epidemic diseases spread rapidly through slave populations, causing high mortality rates that owners attempted to address only when their economic interests were threatened. Malnutrition was endemic among enslaved populations, leading to increased susceptibility to infectious diseases and slower recovery from injuries. The basic diet provided to slaves was calculated to maintain work capacity rather than optimal health, resulting in chronic deficiencies in vitamins, minerals, and protein. Children were particularly affected by malnutrition, often showing stunted growth and developmental delays. Occupational hazards created specific health problems for different categories of slaves. Mining slaves suffered from lung diseases caused by dust inhalation, while agricultural workers faced injuries from tools and animals. Domestic slaves might be exposed to burns from cooking fires or injuries from accident-prone household tasks. The lack of safety precautions meant that workplace injuries were common and often severe. Infectious diseases spread rapidly in overcrowded slave quarters where sanitation was poor and medical care was minimal. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other communicable diseases could devastate slave populations, particularly during times of stress or poor nutrition. These epidemics sometimes forced owners to improve conditions temporarily, but such improvements were usually minimal and temporary. Mental health conditions were common among enslaved people but were rarely recognized or treated in ancient societies. The trauma of enslavement, family separation, and constant abuse created depression, anxiety, and other psychological disorders that affected slaves' ability to function. However, mental health problems were typically interpreted as laziness or defiance rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. Reproductive health issues affected enslaved women disproportionately due to forced breeding, sexual abuse, and inadequate care during pregnancy and childbirth. Maternal mortality rates were high, and many enslaved women suffered from complications that affected their ability to work or bear additional children. These health problems were often ignored unless they significantly impacted the woman's economic value. Medical treatment and healthcare access. Medical care for enslaved people was limited and primarily focused on maintaining their ability to work rather than promoting overall health and well-being. Owners provided medical treatment when slaves' conditions threatened their productivity or when valuable skilled slaves required care to protect the owner's investment. Slave infirmaries, valetudinaria, existed on large estates and in major slave-owning operations, providing basic medical care for injured or sick workers. These facilities were typically staffed by enslaved medical practitioners who had received training in basic treatments and surgical procedures. However, the quality of care was generally poor, and many conditions were considered untreatable. Self-medication and folk remedies were common among enslaved people who had little access to professional medical care. Slaves with knowledge of herbal medicine or traditional healing practices might treat their fellow slaves, though such activities had to be conducted secretly to avoid accusations of witchcraft or poisoning. The medical knowledge possessed by some enslaved people was often superior to that available to free citizens, particularly in cases where slaves had been trained as physicians in their homelands before capture. Greek slave doctors were highly valued in Roman society and might treat wealthy patients while remaining in bondage themselves. This created the paradox of enslaved healers caring for their social superiors. Surgical procedures on slaves were often performed without anesthesia or proper sanitation, as the comfort and survival of enslaved patients was considered less important than minimizing costs. Archaeological evidence reveals that many slaves suffered from poorly healed fractures, infected wounds, and other conditions that suggest inadequate medical care. Veterinary knowledge was sometimes applied to enslaved people, particularly on large estates where the same individuals cared for both animals and human property. This approach reinforced the dehumanization of slavery by explicitly treating people as livestock, though it sometimes resulted in practical medical care that prolonged slaves' working lives. Life expectancy and mortality. Life expectancy for enslaved people was significantly lower than for free citizens, with the harshest forms of slavery reducing average lifespans to just a few years. Mining slaves had the shortest life expectancies, often dying within 2 to 3 years of beginning underground work. Agricultural slaves lived longer but still faced high mortality rates from disease, accidents, and exhaustion. Child mortality was extremely high among enslaved populations, with many children dying before reaching productive age. This high child mortality was partly due to inadequate nutrition and medical care, but it also reflected the deliberate neglect of slave children who were not expected to be immediately productive. Infant mortality rates may have exceeded 50% in some slave populations. The causes of death among enslaved people included workplace accidents, disease, malnutrition, and violence. Detailed records from some large estates reveal mortality patterns that show higher death rates during periods of intensive work or poor weather conditions. These records were maintained primarily for economic planning rather than humanitarian concern. Seasonal mortality patterns affected slave populations, with higher death rates during winter months when food was scarce and working conditions were particularly harsh. Summer months also saw increased mortality from heat exhaustion and waterborne diseases. These seasonal variations influenced slave management practices and market prices. The disposal of slave bodies reflected their marginal status, with most receiving minimal burial rites and unmarked graves. Mass burial sites have been discovered near major slave-employing operations, revealing the scale of slave mortality and the casual attitude toward slave deaths. However, Some evidence suggests that slave communities maintained their own memorial practices despite official neglect. Comparative mortality data reveals that enslaved people in different roles and regions faced vastly different survival prospects. Urban domestic slaves generally lived longer than rural agricultural workers, while skilled craftsmen had better survival rates than unskilled laborers. These variations reflected differences in working conditions, nutrition, and medical care rather than inherent differences between individuals. Manumission and paths to freedom. Mechanisms of liberation. Manumission, the legal process of freeing slaves, provided the only legitimate path from bondage to freedom in ancient societies. However, manumission was entirely at the discretion of slave owners and was granted for various reasons that usually served the master's interests rather than humanitarian concerns. The possibility of freedom, no matter how remote, provided hope that helped maintain order within slave populations while also serving as a tool of control. Roman law recognized several formal methods of manumission, including declaration before a magistrate, manumissio vindicta, inclusion in a will, manumissio testamento, and registration in a census, manumissio censu. Each method had different legal implications for the freed person's status and rights. The complexity of these procedures ensured that manumission required significant planning and legal knowledge. Self-purchase was one path to freedom for slaves who had been allowed to accumulate peculium, personal savings. This money might come from tips, side work, or small business activities that owners permitted. However, the amount required for self-purchase was typically substantial, and many slaves who saved for years never accumulated sufficient funds. Owners could also confiscate peculium at any time, making self-purchase uncertain even for diligent savers. Military service occasionally provided opportunities for freedom, particularly during periods of crisis when states needed additional soldiers. Some enslaved people were freed in exchange for military service, though this was relatively rare and usually occurred only during desperate circumstances. Gladiators who survived numerous combats might occasionally earn freedom through their fighting prowess, though the mortality rate in gladiatorial combat made this an unlikely path. Faithful service over many years sometimes resulted in manumission, particularly for domestic slaves who had developed personal relationships with their owners. These freed slaves often remained economically dependent on their former masters and might continue to live in the same households while receiving small wages for their continued service. Such arrangements benefited owners by reducing their support obligations while maintaining access to skilled workers. Special circumstances like saving an owner's life, revealing conspiracies, or providing exceptional service might result in immediate manumission as a reward. However, these dramatic liberations were extremely rare and usually involved slaves who already had privileged positions within their households. The unpredictability of such rewards meant that most slaves could not count on exceptional service leading to freedom. Life after freedom. Freed slaves, known as libertini in Rome, occupied a complex social position between slavery and full citizenship. While legally free, they faced numerous restrictions and social stigmas that limited their opportunities and marked them as former slaves. The experience of freedmen reveals both the possibilities and limitations of escaping slavery in ancient societies. Legal restrictions on freedmen included limitations on political participation, military service, and marriage rights. Former slaves could not hold public office, serve as jurors, or marry into certain social classes. These restrictions were intended to maintain social hierarchies and prevent former slaves from achieving full equality with freeborn citizens. Economic opportunities for freedmen varied significantly based on their skills, connections, and the circumstances of their manumission. Some freed slaves became successful business owners, craftsmen, or professionals who accumulated considerable wealth despite their social limitations. Others remained economically dependent on their former masters or struggled with poverty and discrimination. Patron-client relationships between former masters and freed slaves created ongoing obligations and dependencies that limited the practical freedom of manumitted individuals. Freedmen were expected to provide continued services to their former owners and show appropriate deference and gratitude. These relationships could provide protection and opportunities but also perpetuated elements of the master-slave dynamic. Social integration was challenging for freed slaves who had to navigate complex social hierarchies while bearing the stigma of former bondage. Their children typically had better social prospects, as the stigma of slavery gradually diminished over generations. However, freed slaves themselves often remained outsiders in free society despite their legal status. Some freedmen achieved remarkable success and influence despite their origins. Wealthy freed slaves might own slaves themselves, become patrons of the arts, or achieve recognition for their achievements in business or the professions. These success stories provided inspiration for enslaved people while also demonstrating the possibilities that freedom could offer. The psychological adjustment to freedom was often difficult for people who had spent most or all of their lives in bondage. Former slaves had to learn to make independent decisions, manage their own affairs, and navigate social relationships as equals rather than subordinates. This transition required developing new skills and confidence that many found challenging. Generational impact. The effects of slavery extended beyond the lives of enslaved individuals to impact their descendants for generations. Children and grandchildren of freed slaves carried both the stigma of slave ancestry and the trauma passed down through family narratives and cultural memory. Understanding these generational impacts is crucial for comprehending the full scope of slavery's effects on ancient societies. Legal disabilities affecting the descendants of slaves varied between different ancient societies but generally included some limitations on political participation and social mobility. In Rome, the children of freed slaves, libertini, had better legal status than their parents but still faced some restrictions that distinguished them from freeborn citizens. Full legal equality might not be achieved until the third generation. Cultural transmission of survival skills and resistance strategies occurred within families and communities of freed slaves and their descendants. Former slaves taught their children about navigating discrimination, recognizing opportunities, and maintaining dignity in the face of social prejudice. These lessons reflected both the trauma of slavery and the resilience developed through surviving it. Economic advantages sometimes accrued to the descendants of freed slaves who had accumulated wealth or developed valuable skills during or after their enslavement. Some freed slave families became successful merchants, craftsmen, or landowners who could provide their children with education and opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. Social integration improved over generations as the direct memory of slavery faded and successful descendants established themselves in their communities. However, social prejudice against slave ancestry could persist for centuries, affecting marriage prospects, business relationships, and social acceptance even for wealthy and accomplished individuals. The psychological legacy of slavery included both trauma and resilience that shaped family cultures and individual identities for generations. Descendants of enslaved people often displayed remarkable determination to succeed and strong family loyalty that reflected both the hardships their ancestors had endured and the values that had helped them survive. Community networks among freed slaves and their descendants provided mutual support, business opportunities, and social connections that helped overcome the isolation and discrimination they faced in broader society. These communities sometimes maintained cultural traditions and practices that connected them to their ancestors' pre-enslavement heritage. Trauma and mental health. The psychological impact of slavery was profound and multifaceted, affecting every aspect of enslaved people's mental and emotional lives. The trauma began with the initial experience of enslavement, whether through capture in warfare, kidnapping, or birth into bondage, and continued through daily experiences of dehumanization, violence, and powerlessness. Acute trauma responses were common among newly enslaved individuals who had to rapidly adjust to their loss of freedom and autonomy. These responses might include depression, anxiety, dissociation, and various forms of psychological withdrawal. The sudden transition from freedom to bondage was particularly devastating for those captured in warfare or kidnapping, who had to cope with both their personal loss and often the destruction of their entire communities. Chronic stress from living under constant threat of punishment, separation from loved ones, and unpredictable treatment created lasting psychological effects. Enslaved people developed hypervigilance and other survival responses that helped them navigate dangerous situations but also created ongoing mental health challenges. The inability to control even basic aspects of their lives contributed to feelings of helplessness and despair. Adaptation strategies developed by enslaved people included psychological mechanisms for coping with trauma and maintaining mental health despite horrific circumstances. Some individuals developed the ability to emotionally distance themselves from their suffering while maintaining their essential humanity. Others found strength through spiritual practices, community relationships, or hope for eventual freedom. The development of resilience among enslaved people was remarkable, as many individuals found ways to maintain their sense of self and humanity despite systematic attempts at dehumanization. This resilience was often supported by community networks, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs that provided meaning and purpose even in bondage. Intergenerational trauma affected slave families and communities as the psychological effects of slavery were passed down through family relationships and cultural memory. Children born into slavery absorbed the trauma and survival strategies of their parents, creating patterns of behavior and belief that reflected their community's historical experiences of oppression. Mental health support within slave communities was informal but often effective, with community members providing emotional support, practical assistance, and spiritual guidance to those struggling with psychological distress. These support systems had to operate within the constraints of slavery but demonstrated the human capacity for mutual care even in the most difficult circumstances. Identity and self-concept. The maintenance of personal identity under slavery required constant effort and creativity, as the institution was designed to strip away individual dignity and reduce people to interchangeable units of labor. Enslaved people developed various strategies for preserving their sense of self while appearing to conform to their master's expectations. Name preservation was one form of identity resistance, as enslaved people often secretly maintained their original names while using the names assigned by their owners in public. Community members might know each other by their true names while using slave names in the presence of masters or overseers. This dual naming system allowed for the preservation of pre-enslavement identity within slave communities. Cultural identity maintenance involved preserving traditions, languages, and customs from enslaved people's homelands despite pressure to assimilate into their master's culture. This might include secret celebrations of traditional holidays, the teaching of ancestral languages to children, or the preservation of traditional crafts and artistic practices. Such activities provided connections to pre-enslavement life and maintained cultural continuity. Skill development and expertise allowed some enslaved people to maintain dignity and self-respect through their professional accomplishments. A slave who became an expert craftsman, healer, or administrator could take pride in their abilities even while remaining in bondage. These skills also provided some protection against abuse and might create opportunities for better treatment or eventual freedom. Moral frameworks developed within slave communities provided guidance for maintaining ethical behavior and human dignity despite the corrupting influences of slavery. These moral systems often drew from religious traditions, cultural values, and practical wisdom about surviving oppression while maintaining one's humanity. Personal relationships and emotional connections with family members, friends, and community members provided anchors for identity and sources of meaning that transcended the dehumanizing aspects of slavery. These relationships required protection and nurturing despite the constant threats of separation and punishment. The creation of alternative social hierarchies within slave communities allowed individuals to achieve status and recognition based on factors other than their relationship to masters. Respect for wisdom, skill, kindness, or spiritual leadership provided ways for enslaved people to value themselves and each other independently of their masters' valuations. Adaptation and survival strategies. Enslaved people developed sophisticated strategies for surviving and occasionally thriving within the constraints of their bondage. These survival strategies required careful assessment of risks and opportunities, along with the development of skills for managing dangerous relationships and situations. Behavioral adaptation involved learning to read their master's moods and preferences to avoid punishment and possibly gain favor. Successful slaves became expert at anticipating their owner's needs, providing satisfactory service, and avoiding actions that might trigger violent responses. This emotional labor was exhausting but essential for survival. Alliance formation with other slaves, sympathetic free individuals, or even rival masters provided protection and opportunities that isolated individuals could not achieve alone. These alliances had to be carefully managed to avoid appearing as threats to existing power structures while still providing mutual support and assistance. Information networks allowed enslaved people to stay informed about opportunities, dangers, and changes in their circumstances. Knowledge about potential sales, punishment plans, or opportunities for advancement could be crucial for making survival decisions. These information networks operated through various channels including other slaves, free workers, and occasionally sympathetic masters. Skill development provided enslaved people with tools for improving their circumstances and potentially earning freedom. Slaves who made themselves indispensable through specialized knowledge or abilities gained some protection against arbitrary treatment and might accumulate resources for eventual self-purchase. Psychological survival strategies included various methods for maintaining hope, dignity, and sanity despite constant dehumanization. These might involve spiritual practices, cultural preservation, creative expression, or the development of inner lives that remained beyond their master's control. Artistic and intellectual achievements. Despite the constraints of slavery, enslaved people made significant contributions to ancient art, literature, philosophy, and scientific knowledge. These achievements were often uncredited or attributed to their masters, but evidence reveals that enslaved individuals were responsible for many of the cultural accomplishments associated with ancient civilizations. Enslaved artisans created much of the decorative art, sculpture, and architectural ornamentation that defined ancient aesthetic traditions. The skilled work visible in Roman villas, Greek temples, and Egyptian monuments was often produced by enslaved craftsmen whose artistic abilities were developed through years of training and practice. These anonymous artists created works that continue to be admired thousands of years later. Literary contributions by enslaved people included both original compositions and the preservation of oral traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Some enslaved individuals were highly educated and produced philosophical works, poetry, and historical accounts, though these were often published under their masters' names or remained anonymous. The preservation of cultural traditions through oral transmission was a crucial function performed by enslaved storytellers and cultural practitioners. Scientific and technical innovations often came from enslaved people who worked in crafts, agriculture, and manufacturing. Their practical experience and necessity-driven creativity led to improvements in tools, techniques, and processes that benefited entire societies. However, these innovations were typically claimed by their masters or attributed to free supervisors rather than their actual creators. Educational services provided by enslaved teachers and tutors shaped the intellectual development of many free citizens, including some who became prominent leaders, writers, and thinkers. The irony of enslaved people educating their social superiors was largely ignored by ancient societies, but it demonstrates the intellectual contributions that enslaved individuals made to their civilizations. Musical and performance traditions were significantly influenced by enslaved artists who brought diverse cultural traditions to their new environments. The fusion of different musical styles, dance forms, and theatrical practices created new artistic traditions that enriched ancient cultures. However, enslaved performers were rarely credited with their creative contributions. Technological knowledge transferred by enslaved people included agricultural techniques, craft methods, and engineering skills that they brought from their homelands. This knowledge transfer was particularly important in conquered territories where enslaved specialists taught their techniques to local populations, contributing to economic development and technological advancement. Language and communication. The linguistic impact of slavery was enormous, as enslaved people from diverse backgrounds brought their languages into contact with each other and with the languages of their masters. This contact created new dialects, influenced vocabulary development, and contributed to the evolution of languages throughout the ancient world. Multilingualism was common among enslaved people who needed to communicate with masters, overseers, fellow slaves, and customers in various languages. This linguistic adaptability made many slaves valuable as interpreters, translators, and intermediaries in international trade and diplomacy. However, their language skills were exploited for their masters' benefit rather than their own advancement. Secret communication systems developed within slave communities included coded language, symbolic messaging, and gestural communication that allowed for private conversations and the coordination of resistance activities. These communication systems had to be sophisticated enough to convey complex information while remaining invisible to overseers and masters. The preservation of ancestral languages within slave communities was a form of cultural resistance that maintained connections to pre-enslavement identities. Parents secretly taught their children traditional languages, and community elders preserved ancient stories, songs, and oral traditions in their original forms. This linguistic preservation was crucial for maintaining cultural continuity. Written communication among literate slaves provided opportunities for maintaining relationships with separated family members and coordinating activities across different locations. Letters preserved on papyrus and other writing materials reveal that some enslaved people maintained extensive correspondence networks despite the risks involved in secret communication. The influence of slave languages on the dominant languages of ancient societies was significant but often unrecognized. Vocabulary, grammatical structures, and pronunciations borrowed from slave languages enriched the linguistic development of Greek, Latin, and other ancient languages. This influence continued even after the sources were forgotten, leaving permanent linguistic legacies. Language learning represented both opportunity and oppression for enslaved people. Mastering their master's language was essential for survival and advancement, but it also represented a form of cultural assimilation that could distance them from their original identities. The process of language acquisition under slavery involved complex negotiations between adaptation and resistance, cultural syncretism and innovation. The forced mixing of diverse populations under slavery created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and synthesis. Enslaved people from different regions brought their traditions, knowledge, and practices into contact with each other and with the cultures of their masters, creating new hybrid forms of cultural expression. Religious syncretism was particularly notable, as enslaved people combined elements from their ancestral traditions with the religious practices they encountered in their new environments. This blending created new religious movements and practices that influenced the development of ancient religions. The appeal of mystery religions and early Christianity to enslaved populations partly reflected their syncretic adaptability. Culinary traditions were significantly influenced by enslaved cooks who adapted their traditional recipes to available ingredients and local tastes. The fusion cooking that resulted from this adaptation created new flavors and cooking techniques that became integrated into regional cuisines. However, enslaved cooks rarely received credit for their culinary innovations. Craft traditions evolved through the exchange of techniques between enslaved artisans from different cultural backgrounds. A Roman workshop might include slaves from Gaul, Greece, Egypt, and Germania, each bringing different methods and aesthetic traditions. The synthesis of these diverse approaches often resulted in new artistic styles and technical innovations. Medical knowledge combined traditional healing practices from various cultures with local medicinal traditions. Enslaved healers often possessed knowledge of plants, treatments, and surgical techniques that were unknown to local practitioners. This medical syncretism advanced healing practices while enslaved practitioners remained in bondage. Musical and performance innovations resulted from the combination of diverse artistic traditions within slave communities. Enslaved musicians and performers created new forms of entertainment that blended their ancestral traditions with local preferences. These innovations often became popular with free audiences while their creators remained unrecognized and unrewarded. The preservation and transmission of cultural knowledge was a crucial function performed by enslaved people who served as living libraries of traditional practices, techniques, and wisdom. Without their efforts to maintain and pass on cultural traditions, much ancient knowledge would have been lost during periods of conquest and social disruption. Archaeological evidence and material culture. Archaeological discoveries. Archaeological excavations throughout the former territories of ancient civilizations have revealed extensive evidence about slave life that supplements and sometimes contradicts literary sources. This material evidence provides insights into the daily experiences of enslaved people that were rarely recorded in written documents produced by and for free citizens. Slave quarters excavated at sites like Pompeii, Herculaneum, and various Roman villas reveal the physical conditions under which enslaved people lived. These archaeological findings show cramped living spaces, basic furnishings, and evidence of the material culture that slaves created within their limited circumstances. The contrast between slave quarters and masters' accommodations demonstrates the stark inequalities of ancient societies. Burial sites and cemeteries provide crucial evidence about slave mortality, health conditions, and cultural practices. Skeletal remains reveal evidence of hard labor, poor nutrition, violence, and disease that characterized slave life. However, these sites also show evidence of care for the dead and cultural practices that maintained human dignity even in death. Workshop excavations reveal the working conditions and production methods used in enterprises that employed enslaved labor. Archaeological evidence from pottery workshops, metalworking sites, and textile production areas shows the scale of slave employment and the techniques used to organize and control enslaved workers. These findings also reveal the high level of skill achieved by many enslaved craftsmen. Personal artifacts found in slave contexts include religious objects, jewelry, gaming pieces, and other small items that reveal the private lives and personal interests of enslaved people. These artifacts demonstrate that slaves maintained personal identities and interests despite their legal status as property, providing evidence of their persistent humanity. Inscriptions and graffiti created by or mentioning enslaved people provide direct evidence of their experiences, relationships, and concerns. These inscriptions, found on walls, tombstones, and various surfaces, offer rare glimpses into the thoughts and feelings of enslaved individuals expressed in their own words. Tool and equipment discoveries show the implements used by enslaved workers and reveal information about working conditions, production methods, and the physical demands placed on enslaved laborers. The wear patterns and modifications found on these tools provide evidence of how slaves adapted their equipment to make their work more efficient or bearable. Material possessions and personal items. The material possessions of enslaved people were severely limited, but archaeological evidence reveals that they did manage to acquire and maintain personal items that provided comfort, identity, and connections to their cultural heritage. These possessions had to be small, easily concealed, and of minimal obvious value to avoid confiscation by masters. Religious artifacts found in slave contexts include amulets, small statues, and ritual objects that demonstrate the continued importance of spiritual life among enslaved people. These items often combined elements from different religious traditions, reflecting the syncretic practices that enslaved people developed to maintain their spiritual connections while appearing to conform to their masters' religious requirements. Personal jewelry and decorative items found in slave quarters were usually simple and made from inexpensive materials, but they served important functions in maintaining individual identity and self-respect. These items might include rings, bracelets, hair ornaments, or pins that allowed enslaved people to express personal taste and maintain some control over their appearance. Gaming pieces and entertainment objects reveal that enslaved people found ways to create leisure activities and social interaction despite their limited circumstances. Dice, game boards, and toy-like objects found in slave contexts demonstrate that play and entertainment remained important for maintaining morale and community bonds. Tools and craft implements sometimes became personal possessions when enslaved craftsmen were allowed to maintain their own equipment. These tools might be modified or personalized in ways that reflected their users' skills and preferences. The quality and condition of personal tools could also indicate the status and treatment of individual slaves within their work environments. Writing materials and literacy objects found in slave contexts provide evidence of education and intellectual activity among enslaved people. Styluses, wax tablets, and scraps of papyrus with writing exercises show that some slaves achieved literacy and used their education for personal purposes as well as their master's business. Storage containers and personal furniture pieces found in slave quarters reveal how enslaved people organized their limited living spaces and possessions. These items were usually simple and functional, but they demonstrate the human need to create organized, personalized living environments even under the most constrained circumstances. The architecture of slave housing was deliberately designed to control, confine, and dehumanize enslaved people while providing the minimum accommodation necessary for their survival and productivity. Archaeological evidence reveals consistent patterns in slave housing that reflect the priorities and concerns of slave-owning societies. Rural slave housing typically consisted of barrack-style buildings that maximized occupancy while minimizing cost and comfort. These structures were often built near work sites to reduce transportation time and were designed with security features like limited entrances and windows to prevent escape. The ergastula, slave prisons, were the most extreme form of rural slave housing, essentially functioning as prisons where slaves were kept chained at night. Urban slave quarters were usually integrated into their masters' homes but were clearly segregated and inferior to free family accommodations. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii shows slave rooms that were small, poorly lit, and accessible only through service areas of houses. These spaces were functional but austere, providing sleeping and storage areas without consideration for comfort or privacy. The organization of space within slave quarters reflects both the constraints imposed by masters and the ways enslaved people adapted their environments to meet their needs. Evidence suggests that slaves created informal divisions within shared spaces, established areas for specific activities like cooking or religious practice, and personalized their spaces with decorations and arrangements that provided some sense of home. Sanitation facilities for slaves were minimal and often shared among large numbers of people. Latrines, washing areas, and waste disposal systems for slave quarters were basic and frequently inadequate, contributing to disease transmission and poor health conditions. The contrast between slave sanitation facilities and those provided for free citizens was stark and deliberate. Workshop spaces where slaves worked often combined production areas with living quarters, creating environments where enslaved people spent virtually their entire lives. These combined spaces were designed for efficiency and control rather than human comfort, with work areas that prioritized production over worker safety or well-being. The evolution of slave housing over time reflects changing attitudes towards slave management and economic considerations. Some later Roman villas show evidence of slightly improved slave quarters, possibly reflecting increased investment in slave welfare as replacement costs rose. However, these improvements were minimal and focused on practical considerations rather than humanitarian concerns. Comparative analysis across civilizations. Similarities across cultures. Despite significant variations in specific practices and legal frameworks, slavery in ancient civilizations shared fundamental characteristics that reveal common approaches to the exploitation and control of human beings. These similarities suggest that certain methods of dehumanization and control were independently developed across different cultures facing similar challenges of managing enslaved populations. The legal classification of enslaved people as property rather than persons was universal across ancient civilizations, though the specific legal frameworks varied. This fundamental legal principle established that slaves had no rights, could not own property, and existed solely to serve their master's interests. The consistency of this legal approach across different cultures demonstrates the systematic nature of ancient slavery. Physical control mechanisms including chains, prisons, and surveillance systems were employed by all slave-owning societies to prevent escape and maintain discipline. The specific technologies and methods varied, but the underlying principle of using physical restraint and monitoring to control enslaved people was universal. These control systems reveal the constant fear that slave owners had of resistance and rebellion. Work organization patterns were remarkably similar across different civilizations, with enslaved people typically assigned to the most dangerous, difficult, and undesirable tasks while free citizens performed supervisory or skilled roles. This division of labor was economically motivated but also served to reinforce social hierarchies and maintain the distinction between free and enslaved status. Family disruption strategies were employed by all slave-owning societies as methods of control and profit maximization. The systematic separation of families served both to prevent the development of strong community bonds that might support resistance and to maximize the economic utility of individual slaves by assigning them to roles based solely on their productive capacity. Religious and cultural suppression occurred across ancient civilizations as masters attempted to eliminate enslaved people's connections to their ancestral identities and replace them with loyalty to their new circumstances. However, the persistence of cultural practices despite these efforts also demonstrates the universal human need for cultural identity and community connection. The use of sexual exploitation as a tool of control and profit was common across ancient slave-owning societies, with enslaved women and children facing particular vulnerability to sexual abuse. This exploitation served both the personal desires of masters and the economic goal of producing new slaves through forced reproduction. Differences in treatment and conditions. While slavery shared common features across ancient civilizations, significant differences existed in specific practices, legal protections, and opportunities for advancement. These differences reflected varying cultural values, economic systems, and political structures that influenced how slavery was implemented and experienced. Manumission practices varied significantly between cultures, with some societies providing more opportunities for enslaved people to achieve freedom than others. Roman law developed complex procedures for freeing slaves and provided legal frameworks for the integration of freed slaves into society, while other cultures offered fewer formal mechanisms for achieving freedom. Religious integration differed across civilizations, with some societies incorporating enslaved people into religious communities while others maintained strict religious segregation. The extent to which enslaved people could participate in religious life affected their opportunities for community formation and cultural preservation. Legal protections for slaves, while minimal everywhere, varied in their specific provisions and effectiveness. Some legal systems provided basic protections against the most extreme forms of abuse, while others granted masters completely unlimited power over their enslaved property. These differences could significantly affect the daily experiences of enslaved people. Economic opportunities for enslaved people varied based on the complexity and diversity of different ancient economies. Highly developed commercial societies like those of Greece and Rome provided more opportunities for skilled slaves to earn money and potentially purchase freedom, while simpler agricultural societies offered fewer such opportunities. Social mobility within slavery differed across civilizations, with some societies developing more complex hierarchies that allowed for advancement within the enslaved population. These hierarchies could provide incentives for cooperation and skill development while also creating divisions within slave communities. Treatment of slave families varied between cultures, with some societies showing more tolerance for slave-family relationships while others systematically prevented family formation. These differences affected the social structures and support systems available within enslaved communities. Long-term historical impact. The institution of slavery profoundly shaped the development of ancient civilizations in ways that continued to influence societies long after formal slavery was abolished. The economic prosperity, cultural achievements, and political power of ancient states were built on the foundation of enslaved labor, creating legacies that persisted for centuries. Economic development patterns established during periods of widespread slavery influenced the structure of ancient economies and the distribution of wealth and power. The concentration of resources in the hands of slave-owning elites created social hierarchies and economic inequalities that shaped political institutions and cultural values for generations. Cultural achievements attributed to ancient civilizations often involved significant contributions from enslaved people whose work was uncredited or misattributed. Understanding this hidden contribution of enslaved labor provides a more accurate picture of how ancient cultures developed their artistic, intellectual, and technological accomplishments. Social attitudes toward human dignity, individual rights, and social equality were profoundly influenced by the normalization of slavery in ancient societies. The acceptance of human bondage as natural and necessary shaped philosophical, religious, and political thought in ways that influenced the development of ideas about freedom, citizenship, and human rights. Legal traditions established during periods of slavery continued to influence legal systems long after formal abolition. Concepts of property rights, personal autonomy, and legal standing that were developed in slave-owning societies carried forward into later legal traditions, sometimes perpetuating elements of inequality and discrimination. The demographic impact of slavery affected population distributions, ethnic compositions, and cultural development throughout the ancient world. The large-scale movement of enslaved people from their homelands to distant regions created diaspora communities and cultural mixing that influenced the development of regional civilizations. Religious and philosophical responses to slavery influenced the development of ancient thought and continued to shape intellectual traditions for centuries. The tension between slavery and emerging ideas about human dignity and spiritual equality contributed to philosophical and theological developments that eventually supported the abolition of slavery. Conclusion: understanding ancient slavery's human cost. The examination of slavery in the ancient world reveals an institution of staggering cruelty and systematic dehumanization that affected millions of people across centuries and civilizations. The lives of enslaved people were marked by constant vulnerability, loss of autonomy, and the denial of basic human dignity. Yet within this brutal system, enslaved individuals demonstrated remarkable resilience, creativity, and humanity that challenges simplistic narratives about ancient slavery. The diversity of slave experiences across different roles, regions, and time periods demonstrates that slavery was not a monolithic institution but rather a complex system that adapted to different economic needs and cultural contexts. However, this diversity should not obscure the fundamental injustice and brutality that characterized all forms of ancient slavery. Whether working in mines or palaces, whether born into bondage or captured in war, all enslaved people suffered the trauma of being treated as property rather than human beings. The economic importance of slavery to ancient civilizations cannot be understated. The prosperity, cultural achievements, and military power of societies like Rome, Athens, and Egypt were built on the foundation of enslaved labor. This economic dependence on slavery influenced political decisions, military campaigns, and social policies in ways that perpetuated and expanded the institution. Understanding this economic dimension is crucial for comprehending how slavery became so deeply embedded in ancient societies. The resistance strategies employed by enslaved people reveal their persistent humanity and refusal to accept complete dehumanization. From individual acts of defiance to large-scale rebellions, from cultural preservation to community formation, enslaved people found countless ways to assert their dignity and maintain their humanity despite systematic oppression. These acts of resistance demonstrate the inherent human drive for freedom and dignity that no system of oppression could completely eliminate. The psychological and social impact of slavery extended far beyond the immediate experiences of enslaved individuals to affect entire communities and societies. The trauma of slavery was transmitted across generations through family relationships and cultural memory, while the normalization of human bondage influenced social attitudes and legal institutions that persisted long after formal abolition. The legacy of ancient slavery includes both the specific historical injustices suffered by millions of enslaved people and the broader lessons about human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. The detailed documentation available about ancient slavery provides insights into how systems of oppression operate and how people resist and survive under even the most difficult circumstances. Modern understanding of ancient slavery has been enhanced by archaeological discoveries, new analytical methods, and changing perspectives that recognize enslaved people as historical actors rather than passive victims. This scholarship reveals the complexity of slave experiences and the sophisticated strategies that enslaved people developed for survival and resistance. The study of ancient slavery also illuminates the historical roots of later forms of human bondage and exploitation. The legal frameworks, economic justifications, and social attitudes developed in ancient societies influenced subsequent forms of slavery and continue to shape contemporary discussions about human rights, equality, and social justice. Perhaps most importantly, examining the lives of enslaved people in the ancient world honors the memory and experiences of millions of individuals who suffered under these systems while contributing to the civilizations that oppressed them. Their stories, preserved in fragments through archaeological evidence, legal documents, and literary sources, remind us of both the terrible costs of human exploitation and the remarkable capacity of people to maintain their humanity under the most dehumanizing circumstances. The courage, creativity, and resilience demonstrated by enslaved people throughout ancient history provide inspiration and lessons that remain relevant today. Their struggles for dignity, freedom, and human recognition continue to resonate in contemporary efforts to combat exploitation and promote human rights. Understanding their experiences helps us appreciate both the progress that has been made in recognizing human dignity and the ongoing vigilance required to prevent new forms of exploitation and dehumanization. The comprehensive examination of ancient slavery ultimately reveals that while the specific institutions and practices of the past may be gone, the fundamental questions about human dignity, social justice, and the treatment of vulnerable populations remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. The voices of enslaved people from antiquity, speaking through the archaeological and historical record, continue to call for recognition, justice, and remembrance of their suffering and contributions to human civilization.